Podcasting from beautiful Sydney, the city of Opera House, Darling Harbour, Blue Mountains, and beautiful beaches. This is ICU Primary Prepcast, a monthly podcast about physiology and pharmacology in intensive care.
Hi, I'm Maddi.
Hi, I'm Swapnil. And this is our Endocrine Physiology episode number 3, which is the last episode in Endocrine Physiology. And today we are going to discuss about mainly hypothalamus and pituitary. So, can you please briefly describe the structure of hypothalamus?
Sure. So the hypothalamus is a small structure comprising just 4 grams of the 1,400 gram adult brain. However, it has many essential functions and is required for the maintenance of homeostasis. It is part of the diencephalon of the brain, is located anterior and inferior to the thalamus, and forms the lateral walls of the inferior part of the third ventricle. It extends anteriorly from the level of the optic chiasm, posteriorly to the posterior commissure and mammillary bodies. It lies above the pituitary gland, with which it connects to by the infundibulum or the pituitary stalk. The hypothalamus receives an abundant blood supply from branches of the circle of Willis, which encircle the hypothalamus. It has neural connections to numerous areas, including the retina, olfactory bulb, thalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, cerebral cortex, pituitary, brainstem, and spinal cord. The hypothalamus consists of groups of nuclei which can be divided by area rostrocaudally into 4 groups: the preoptic region, supraoptic, tuberal, and mammillary or posterior region. The preoptic region embryologically is part of the telencephalon, but functionally part of the diencephalon. It lies adjacent to the lamina terminalis. The supraoptic region is above the optic chiasm. The tubal region is at the level of the tuber cinereum and includes the infundibulum. And finally, the mammillary or posterior region includes the mammillary bodies. The preoptic and supraoptic regions are sometimes grouped together as the anterior region. The preoptic region is divided into 2 areas, medial and lateral nuclei. The medial preoptic nuclei produce gonadotrophin-releasing hormone and is also thought to be important in the expression of sexual behavior. The medial preoptic nuclei also contain many thermosensitive neurons, and it's a key site for integrating thermal inputs from the skin and from the brain. It is particularly important for heat dissipation. The role of the lateral preoptic nuclei has not been well elucidated. The supraoptic region contains the suprachiasmatic, supraoptic, and paraventricular nuclei. The supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei secrete ADH and oxytocin. The paraventricular nuclei, also along with the arcuate nuclei, produce thyrotropin-releasing hormone, corticotropin-releasing hormone, and somatostatin. The suprachiasmatic nuclei receive retinal inputs and is associated with the control of circadian rhythm. The tubal region contains ventromedial, dorsomedial, arcuate, and lateral nuclei. The dorsomedial and ventromedial nuclei are involved in the control of the urge to eat, with the dorsomedial nuclei regulating the feeding impulse and the ventromedial nuclei regulating the sense of satiety. The lateral nuclei are also involved in the regulation of feeding. The arcuate nuclei produce the hypothalamic releasing hormones, especially growth hormone releasing hormone, and also inhibit prolactin release. The mammillary region contains mammillary and posterior nuclei. The mammillary nuclei is part of the limbic system and is thought to be involved with memory. The posterior nuclei help regulate temperature and is important for heat conservation.
Thanks, Maddi. Can you please outline the functions of the hypothalamus?
So the hypothalamus is vital for the regulation of endocrine, autonomic, and behavioral functions. Functions of the hypothalamus include the regulation of the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus is sometimes referred to as the center or head ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. It directly innervates both the parasympathetic and sympathetic preganglionic neurons, as well as parts of the brainstem that control autonomic reflexes. The hypothalamus is also important in thermoregulation. It receives input from thermoreceptors and then activates mechanisms to either conserve or lose heat. The hypothalamus is also important for the regulation of food intake by receiving inputs from glucostat cells and leptin receptors, which then help control appetite and satiety. It is also important in the regulation of thirst and body water content. It receives input from osmoreceptors and angiotensin II, which then regulate the release of antidiuretic hormone and the sensation of thirst. In terms of its endocrine function, the hypothalamus controls anterior pituitary secretion via the release of hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibitory hormones. These include thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibitory hormone of somatostatin, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and prolactin inhibitory hormone. It also produces ADH and oxytocin. It then controls posterior pituitary hormone release of oxytocin and ADH via nerve impulses. The hypothalamus is also vital for sexual behavior, arousal, and aggression. It controls sexual behavior both via the production of sex hormones through the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone and via neural pathways that have not been fully elucidated. The hypothalamus is also thought to be important in the expression of emotion and in the level of activity of a person. Stimulation of the lateral hypothalamus can increase activity and lead to rage. Stimulation of the ventromedial hypothalamus can cause tranquility. The hypothalamus is also important in the maintenance of circadian rhythm and sleep. It receives input from the retina, which then help to control circadian rhythm. And finally, the hypothalamus is important in terms of memory, reward, and fear. It is thought to contain reward and punishment centers and thus play an important role in regulating behavior. It is also thought to have a role in memory.
Okay, so let's move into another gland, that is pituitary gland. Can you please list the hormones secreted by the pituitary gland and describe their functions?
The pituitary gland is divided into the anterior and the posterior pituitary. We'll first think about the anterior pituitary. There are 5 types of secretory cells within the anterior pituitary: somatotropes, which secrete growth hormone, lactotropes, which secrete prolactin, corticotropes, which secrete ACTH, thyrotropes, which secrete TSH, and gonadotropes, which secrete FSH and LH. With the exception of growth hormone, all of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary exert their main effects by stimulating target glands. Firstly, growth hormone. This promotes growth in most parts of the body, stimulates cartilage and bone growth. It also increases the metabolic rate by 15 to 20%. It has effects on protein, fat, and carbohydrates. In terms of its protein effects, it increases protein synthesis and protein deposition in tissues and decreases protein catabolism. For fat, it increases the use of fat for energy, increases the mobilization of fatty acids from adipose tissue, and increases the use of fatty acids for energy. And in terms of carbohydrate, it decreases the utilization of glucose, decreases tissue uptake of glucose, increases hepatic production of glucose, and increases insulin secretion and can cause insulin resistance. It is sometimes termed diabetogenic. In terms of electrolytes, growth hormone increases gastrointestinal absorption of calcium, but also increases calcium excretion in the urine. The increased absorption of calcium, however, is usually greater than its excretion. Secondly, adrenocorticotropin, or ACTH, is also produced by the anterior pituitary. This stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce adrenocortical hormones. The third hormone is thyroid-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the production and secretion of thyroid hormones. Finally, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates spermatogenesis in males and ovarian follicle maturation in females. And luteinizing hormone causes ovulation by a surge. It also stimulates the secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum in females and the secretion of testosterone in males. And lastly, prolactin results in milk secretion from the breast. The posterior pituitary secretes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone helps regulate osmolarity by increasing the permeability of the collecting ducts of the kidney to water, resulting in water retention in excess of solute. It also causes systemic vasoconstriction, pulmonary vasodilation, release of von Willebrand factor, and factor VIII. Oxytocin causes contraction of the uterus, contraction of the myoepithelial cells in the breast, which causes milk letdown or rejection.
Thanks. And I think that's why pituitary gland is called as the master gland of the body, because not only it just secretes the maximum number of hormones, but it also controls the secretion of other glands. And one of the major axes in the body is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Can you briefly describe how does the hypothalamus control the secretion of hormones from the pituitary gland?
So the production and release of pituitary hormones is regulated by the hypothalamus. It exerts its effects over the anterior pituitary through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, which is a specialized system of fenestrated capillaries. Its proximal part is the anterior hypophyseal artery, which is a branch of the ophthalmic segment of the internal carotid artery. The hypothalamus produces numerous releasing and inhibiting factors, which we described before, which are then transported to the primary plexus located close to the infundibulum of the hypothalamus. The hormones are then drained into a secondary venous plexus that surrounds the anterior pituitary and which allows them to diffuse into the gland. The hypothalamic hormones then control the release of pituitary hormones and act via a feedback loop. The action of the hypothalamic hormones on the pituitary is self-explanatory from their names. However, it should be noted that thyrotropin-releasing hormone causes the release of prolactin in addition to TSH, and somatostatin inhibits TSH as well as the release of growth hormone. As we have already mentioned, the hypothalamus produces antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, but these are then transported via nerve axons in the pituitary stalk to the posterior pituitary gland. The nerve endings contain secretory granules which lie on the surface of capillaries and release ADH or oxytocin by exocytosis when these nerve fibers stimulate it.
Thanks, Maddi. So the last part is of the HPA axis is the adrenal gland. So which hormones are produced by the adrenal gland?
The adrenal glands are composed of two sections, the medulla and the cortex. The medulla is central and secretes the catecholamines dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. It comprises approximately 1/4 of the mass of the adrenal glands. The cortex is composed of three distinct layers, the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa lies just underneath the capsule and secretes aldosterone. The zona fasciculata is in the middle and is the widest layer, comprising 75% of the cortex. It secretes glucocorticoids, cortisol, and corticosterone, as well as small amounts of adrenal androgens and estrogens. The zona reticularis is the deepest layer and secretes dehydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione, as well as small amounts of estrogens and glucocorticoids.
Great. So we have already discussed the steroids in the pharmacology section, and so you can access this podcast on steroids in our previous episodes. So we are going to concentrate mainly on the mineralocorticoid, that is aldosterone, in this podcast. So, Maddi, what is the function of aldosterone?
So aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid steroid hormone, which is produced by the adrenal glands. It is synthesized from cholesterol and requires the presence of aldosterone synthase, which is only present in the zona glomerulosa. It is minimally protein-bound and has a half-life of approximately 20 minutes. In terms of its functions, it acts on the principal cells of the collecting tubules within the kidney and to a lesser extent on the distal tubules and collecting ducts to increase renal tubular reabsorption of sodium and increase secretion of potassium. It does this by increasing the insertion of epithelial sodium channels, or ENaCs, into the cell membrane, and also by increasing the synthesis of ENaCs. This results in sodium retention with associated water retention and potassium and hydrogen excretion. It also increases the sodium reabsorption by the sweat glands, salivary glands, and intestine, and increases potassium uptake into cells. Aldosterone secretion is stimulated by increased potassium. It is particularly sensitive to changes in ECF potassium levels. It is also stimulated by angiotensin II and ACTH, although the ACTH stimulation is transient and wears off after 1 to 2 days. To some extent, aldosterone is stimulated by decreased dietary sodium. However, it does not have a great role in regulating extracellular fluid sodium concentration.
Thanks. We're coming to the end of this episode and we are heading into the school holidays. So hopefully I get holiday from your dad jokes. Is that correct?
Bad is relative.
That's true. Main question is, do I get a holiday from the joke or not?
Oh, no, not today.
Oh my goodness. Okay. What is today's joke, Maddi?
Okay. Why did no one laugh at oxytocin's joke?
Oh, Maddi, come on. Nah, I can't answer this. Sorry.
Because it was a real letdown.
That was a very funny joke, Maddi. I think your quality of jokes are improving.
Or maybe your standards are dropping. It's one or the other.
That's the relative phenomena as well. So, folks, thanks for listening to today's episode. We will be coming back with a bonus episode in next couple of weeks where Maddi and one of the college examiners, Dr. Carton Costello, will be joining us in this podcast to discuss how to prepare for primary exams. Now, I know that written part is over for the second setting, and a lot of people have passed the written exams and they're heading into the Viva section. So all the best to all the candidates. And also those who are preparing for next year, I think that episode will be really useful. So we'll see you in our bonus episode in next couple of weeks. Till then, goodbye.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.